Perhaps you could start off by you telling us, well, introducing yourself first of all, and telling us a bit about how you got your diagnosis and what autism is like for you.
Yes, no problem. So I'm Alice. I'm a 48-year-old autistic woman with attention differences. So I also have ADHD. So I'm multiply neurodivergent. I live in Brighton with my daughter Izzy, who's 12, and she was also late diagnosed autistic with attention differences. And we live in Brighton with our cat Belle, who we make a joke in the family that she's also autistic. And how I've kind of presented that to my daughter is because she's very special and unique. So your question was, how did I get my diagnosis? Throughout this interview or video, I might use slightly different language to you because, and that may be helpful to some of the doctors or interesting to some of the doctors. So I kind of call, rather than using the word diagnosis, I use the word identified. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's slightly different kind of narrative or view on what autism is, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So I was diagnosed / identified age 47, and that came out of my daughter's diagnosis. And what might be interesting to the medical students is, you know, up until age 46, 47, I had been in and out of hundreds of GP rooms, you know, psychologist rooms, psychiatrist rooms, social worker, you know, multi-agency professionals with various, not problems actually, but just because of my work, which I might talk about in a minute, but also my personal and also my professional life and encounters. No one had ever raised the possibility that I could be autistic. Ever. And even when my daughter was late diagnosed and identified within the school setting, she was picked up very, very late. And this will be an emerging theme and story that I talk about in this sort of you know, interview with you. Prior to my daughter getting identified, you know, the lens that was being viewed on my daughter was, you know, emotional behavioural issues. And I think this is really important to kind of highlight to the doctors in terms of identifying neurodivergence in their, you know, in their GP surgeries or in their encounters with people, that it's not what you think it is anymore. So, you know, my daughter had, you know, emotional sort of behavioural stuff bubbling at school, and it was very, very much like a psychodynamic lens, a trauma lens, that sort of stuff. So she was diagnosed around about age 10, and when it was prior to her getting her diagnosis, when it was raised with me, and it wasn't raised by medical staff, it was raised by a primary mental health worker who'd come into the school. So again, you know, I'd been down to the GP surgery loads of times. Oh, my daughter's kicking off at school. She's got emotional, you know, And it was, no one had, you know, identified her as being neurodivergent. It was a primary mental health worker that came into school and said, do you think your daughter's autistic? And I was that parent that said, oh, no, absolutely not. How dare you? And that's where the story starts, really, in terms of answering your question about me. You know, I went from, you know, that Rain Man stereotype came up in my head. That was the only point of reference I had, you know, and I consider myself a, you know, an educated, you know, an educated academic person with really good understanding of diversity. My own work, which I might talk about a bit later on, is with diversity and diverse groups of people. It's with young refugees and asylum seekers. But nevertheless, I had, you know, kind of out of the arc understanding of what autism was, and it was Sheldon, Rain Man, very stereotypical, you know, templates of what autism was. So that was the beginning of the story, and I went on this incredible journey of learning, self-discovery. When I got down out of that high horse of defense, thinking, you know, what, my daughter's autistic, and actually started to read some more current writing, research and understanding, it was like, oh wow. And then obviously doing that piece of work for her and getting a better understanding for her led to, I suddenly saw similarities for myself. And I was like, oh my goodness. Then I went to my GP, who's a family GP and has been with me for 25 years. It's fantastic. But, you know, and was like, yeah, you know, wow, yes. And it was like she also went on that journey of discovery. And, you know, she wasn't a kind of old school GP out of the arc. She, you know, and yet she also didn't have that understanding. And this seems to be now and further along the line, a very, very common story that GPs don't. And it's not, you know, they don't have that understanding, or that kind of more up-to-date understanding, which is, I know what you're doing through your work. So, you know, that was, she referred me through the NHS, and while waiting to get the NHS assessment, because my daughter's own assessment had come up, I decided to go privately. So I got a private diagnosis at the beginning. And again, you know, you said, how did I get my diagnosis? It wasn't because I had particular support needs. It wasn't because I was having problems in my life. So again, this is an interesting thing to kind of flag to GPs, that you may see parents down in your surgery with children, little Johnny's being difficult or something like this. And actually, it may not be a typical like adult coming to you with problems. You might coincidentally on your radar become aware of children that could be neurodivergent, but maybe their family group as well, who are coming into the surgery through discussions with them. That's also a way that it can be picked up as well. So I got a private diagnosis, not out of any support needs or any need for any support. It was more, I think, out of kind of curiosity, but also to help my daughter. It felt really important for my daughter, and I'll say a little bit more about this, that, you know, because it was highly likely she was going to get diagnosed autistic from how, you know, the assessments had been up to her actual diagnosis. So I got diagnosed, and it was out of curiosity, but it didn't really sink in at that particular point. I remember coming out, because it was a private diagnosis, I remember coming out, having gone up to get, you know, to test out whether I was autistic or not, coming out with 2 for the price of 1. I came out, they said, not only are you autistic, we think you have, I use the word attention differences. Again, excuse me, that I tend not to use language around neurodivergence in terms of disorder, you know, deficit, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. So I came back, and it's like almost like, oh, look what I've got. Genuinely, it didn't sink in, but I think I was very focused. It was literally a few days before my daughter's final diagnosis at Seaside View. When Isabel got diagnosed a few days later, it felt very, I was really pleased that I had my diagnosis as well, because then when I went to explain it to her, when we were talking it through, she didn't feel different, disordered, there was something wrong. I could explain it in terms of just a different neurology, and it was a family thing. So yeah, that's how my so that's how my initial diagnosis came about. I then went through the GP system, the NHS system. COVID was very good to us in terms of, you know, because of COVID, they weren't doing in-house assessments. So because I was happy to do my NHS assessment online, that came through very quickly. So rather than wait 2 to 3 years, I waited a year. And that was, I just want to give some feedback, an absolutely fantastic experience, because I obviously had a private assessment to compare it to. And, you know, you hear all these stories around, oh, the NHS is rubbish. It's going to be, you know, it's not going to be good. It's going to be very much the medical model. And we might talk about that in a minute. You know, it's going to be very kind of negative. It was a fantastic experience. And this is something else that I do want to kind of draw out, that the individuals that assessed me, and this is something about Sussex Partnership, that the individuals that assessed me, they were neurodivergent. So that was I just want to give some feedback that was a really good experience to be in clinic with my tribe. Yeah, so, and although it was a professional relationship and it was a professional assessment, you know, that made a huge difference, that having that understanding of, you know, neurodivergence, but actually being neurodivergent as well. And so, yeah, and it was actually that fantastic experience, and actually getting the NHS diagnosis, that was the moment it really, really struck me. And I'll never forget when I got my it was just overwhelming emotion. And you can see I'm, you know, even now just remembering it, it was overwhelming emotion it was a weird mix of relief, even though, as I've said, I didn't need the diagnosis for support, it was relief, it was sorrow, it was loss, it was like, grief for the life that I hadn't known that I had been neurodivergent, and yeah, just, it was an overwhelming moment, and also I remember, sadly, both my parents have passed away, but wishing my parents were here and wishing that they would have been there in that moment, because it was like, wow, knowing now that I'm multiply neurodivergent as identified by the NHS, that I'd got through all my life, unidentified, living in a mainly neurotypical world, which isn't always set up for neurodivergent people, and, having a few slip-ups on the way, but actually more, I suppose, sorry to sound crass, but I'm a success story, as an individual. I've got a fantastic career, and we may talk about this in a minute. I managed to find and be in work, and very successful work at leadership level, setting up my own organization, as a founder and a CEO that's been running 20 years, and thinking, wow, I did all that. And also my proudest achievement of raising, having a child, and raising my child on my own without my family, because they had passed away, without my daughter's dad, and thinking, wow, that is amazing.
That is amazing, Alice. It really is. It's a really amazing story. Thank you. Perhaps could you talk a bit more about what it's like, what it means for you to be neurodivergent? What is that like? What is being neurodivergent for you?
Okay, I mean, this may not answer your question the way that you want it to be, but to be neurodivergent is normal. It's using the word normal for me. So for me, neurodivergent is just a different neurology. So, I've talked a little bit about language, positioning and language. So, for me, it's not a disorder. It's not an illness. It's not something to be, we're not the subjects of doctors to be looked at from the outside in. Yeah, it's a different neurology, and it's an identity, in the same way that, to be, other kind of identity categories like gender or race, So it's not this thing, this kind of esoteric thing that happens out there that you catch or you get, that can be cured or can be fixed. So, the best way of describing that is I fit very much within what I call the neurodiversity paradigm, and your doctors might be, you have your typical mainstream older sort of theory around autism, the original theory around autism, around the medical model, and usually around sort of cognitive theories of autism, and things like theory of mind, central coherence, that sort of stuff. You have, those are the kind of the underpinning, they feed into the diagnostic process, as we know. And then you've got a massive shift away from them, mainly in the sort of the 1980s, 90s, and into the 21st century, out of the neurodiversity movement, called the neurodiversity paradigm, which is, as simple as, it's a different neurology, and it shouldn't be something that is, kind of pathologized. So for me, I don't think, it's not like this thing like I have a disease, like I have cancer. It's not a dirty word anymore. And actually it's because of and despite of, yeah. So it's characterized me as different, and some of those differences can lead to challenges for me or some autistic people, and some of those differences can lead to extra support for me or for other autistic people. But it also, I think it explains my huge creativity and my ability, and other people like Greta have described it in terms of superpowers. So yeah, I mean, and I think also we need to be careful that we don't have these very kind of crude phenotypes, like you either have superpowers or you're a savant or you're kind of Rain Man. I don't think it's like that. Autism, it's it's a spectrum, and it presents very, very differently in so many people. You know, I get all the time, yeah, but you're not autistic, or, you know, all those kind of, you know, the stuff you get around, oh, you're a little bit autistic, or everyone's on the autistic spectrum, or this or that. So no, autism isn't what we think it used to be, and it's much wider and much more varied. But yeah, so for me, it's just a neurological difference, and it explains some of the stuff that I find harder or more challenging, but it accounts for, you know, my creativity and my success in life. Yeah. And, you know, so in terms of how that can manifest, so it's things like, so I believe I experience the world very differently to a neurotypical person. And so that how that can manifest could be in something like, so for example, I have hyper empathy. So for example, the medical model previously looked at autistic people as kind of having lack of empathy. So things like theory of mind, not being able to mentalize, that sort of stuff, and being kind of cut off. And actually, what we know now about autism is that there's a range. Yes, you can have people who, some individuals who are cut off from emotions, like you can have neurotypical people who are cut off and detached from emotions. But then you have, because it's a spectrum, you can have hyper, you have individuals that are highly in, you know, and sometimes to an extreme, and sometimes problematically, in touch with their emotions. So how my hyper empathy might manifest would be, so for example, if I see a dead animal, or animals particularly, you know, on a road, if I remember seeing a fox getting killed, you know, a dead fox on the side of the road, I experienced that as visceral physical pain that then stayed with me for days. So I actually sometimes I have to switch off certain things because it's so intense. So it can trigger not just emotional feeling, but physical pain. So you're carrying around the emotional pain of the death, or the trauma of the death of an animal, for example. So that can be quite hard sometimes. You're also living in a world that is kind of created for neurotypical people. So there's a lot of discussion around how a lot of autistic people have to survive in a world that's not cut out for them. And that's where the social model of disability has come in to try and help create autistic friendly spaces or neurodivergent spaces where autistic people can enter neurotypical spaces and survive them better, because the environments can be quite triggering for them.
And I want to talk a little bit about the kind of sensory processing side of it, because I know that's something that a lot of autistic people find difficult. And you've just touched on that with, you know, talking about environments. And for you in particular, are there any sort of sensory processing things that are particularly difficult for you?
I think, you know, I think so. What we also know now is that sensory profile, I think this is a good thing to raise actually, the sensory profile of autistic people has been massively neglected, that there has been this insistence on kind of cognitive profiling. Actually, sensory only came into DSM-5, I think it was only in 2013, you might correct me, as part of the diagnostic procedure. So it is very, very important, and it's massively neglected. I can talk for myself, which is, I think because I went for so long being undiagnosed, and because you know, the sensory environment is so triggering, so sound, so things like I'm hypersensitive to touch. Okay, so when people touch me, I might jump, or I might experience it like I did, you know, the feeling of the experience of the dead animal. So that's what's actually happening. But how that might present to Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, or whoever is, oh, they're very cold and they don't like you know, do you see what I mean? So you can see how a sensory reaction can then be misinterpreted as something that is wrong, bad, not normal, pathologized. So, you know, so I'm hypersensitive to touch, or if people even come really close to me, I can almost feel their aura and their shield. Yeah, I'm not mad, honestly. And I feel that. Also, I've got auditory processing stuff as well. So what that means is I'm hypersensitive to noises. So particular noises will trigger sometimes anxiety or sometimes pain in my ear, and also will sometimes make me feel quite dizzy. But also because I was late diagnosed so long, and because we didn't have the understanding when I was younger, and because I was never seen as autistic, what a lot of undiagnosed or misdiagnosed autistic people tend to do is they tend to naturally adapt to their environment because they have to survive. They don't have the earplugs, the this, or that, and the other. So I used, I think it's okay to raise this, maybe faulty coping mechanisms. And one of that would have been dissociation. So because the world can be, I can experience the world through, you know, all of my senses as being in glorious technicolor. Well, you know, the only way to survive that is like having the volume up in every, you know, visually, orally, is to just cut off. So it then has the opposite effect, that you're kind of numb from your environment. So you might have individuals presenting down at the GP surgery saying, you know, I'm getting panic attacks, or I'm feeling numb from my, it can then go on. So if things aren't picked up, it can then go on to develop into a mental health issue or an emotional health issue. I don't mind sharing this with you because it's part of the story, and I think it's really important, and it might be something that we discuss later on. There's other pathways into being diagnosed autistic. So in my late teens and early 20s, I had anorexia, and there's a very high correlation between eating disorders, particularly anorexia, with autism. And I think there's that, you know, there's kind of call to put anorexia on the autism spectrum. And again, the reason being, you might think, what's that got to do with being autistic? The reason being, it's interoception. So we're talking about senses, and it might sound crass, but just not feeling hunger, not feeling the sensations. I noticed this in my daughter. She hasn't got anorexia. She hasn't got an eating disorder, but she needs prompting still to eat, drink, use the toilet. She's has difficulties around, you know, appropriate clothing to wear because of temperature. So yeah, I think that's important to raise to the doctors as well, that you will see other people with other conditions, eating issues, or emotional or mental health issues, that actually who are actually autistic. I believe now that locally on some of the CAMS and adolescent units, any girls that are going in with anorexia are automatically getting, you know, tested for autism. So yeah, I think that's important to point out as well.
It is. I'm really glad you brought that up. That's great.
Yeah.
And so we've covered some of the things around what's been difficult in your life, you know, with retrospect actually as well, reflecting back on now that you know. Is there anything else along those lines that was difficult for you, you know, as an adult? We talked about the sensory side of things.
So what was difficult, I suppose, looking back, because I've lived both sides of the, you know, I have this fantastic advantage of living both sides of the river. And you know, to be honest, it's great to be here. Funny enough, it's great to have found my home and my tribe. But looking back, I remember growing up feeling, so if I just, you know, imagine and think back, and my memories of what it was like, not knowing I was autistic, I just always had this feeling that I was different. And sometimes different in a really good way. I was always that really clever girl in the classroom, the girl that knew the big words, the girl that did this or that. But I always had this experience of feeling different. I always remember my parents had this experience. I had this experience that my parents were protecting me. And now looking, and this is what I meant when I said I would like to have cuddled them and said thank you, because it then made sense, because they didn't have the narrative for me, and nor did I have the narrative for them. But I think my mum particularly probably co-regulated with me to help. She was my accommodation, if you like, because I guess she was slightly she probably realised, as we do with our children, that when they're different or they're so yeah, I was very different, you know, not different in a bad way. So this is another thing, you know, I wasn't that geek hiding under the table, no friends, not being able to talk. I'm hyperverbal. So yes, again, you have autistic or neurodivergent people who are selective mute or nonverbal. Okay, but you also have hyperverbal, and so yeah, I had lots of friends. I was very outgoing, but looking back, you know, I always got myself into difficulties and scrapes, and I just couldn't work out why. And we know there's this thing called double empathy. I think this is quite important to raise. You know, again, looking back, having some of the kind of frameworks to look back, this is double empathy thing, which, you know, the medical students might know around how there's this, you know, this cliche that all the autistic people, you know, they don't have empathy and they, you know, they're not very good at understanding others' feelings. But double empathy says it kind of cuts both ways. The neurotypical people don't, it's exactly the same. They're not able to put themselves in the feet of autistic people. So yeah, I always had this feeling that I was different, and what I made of that was there was something wrong with me. There was something bad about me. And then, you know, interestingly, we consider, you know, the kind of the passage of time going into my teens, and then developing when my difficulties really came was in my late teens when I developed anorexia. Now we don't know because we don't know, but you know, it could have been that I was just like my daughter and I had different eating habits. You know, so for example, my daughter how she eats, you know, she doesn't have a disorder, but for example, she doesn't like food touching. She doesn't like certain foods. She doesn't like hard foods or soft foods or whatever. I don't make a song and dance about it. Yeah. That's fine as long as she's eating, and she's eating a range of foods. If she doesn't want to sit up at the table, who cares? You know, sometimes she's required to do certain things on occasion, like we all have to, but most of the time I just adjust and work around her. Therefore, she has not got an eating, she's not disordered. But I look back and I think, you know, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, you know, I think, maybe I was doing that. And then maybe the narrative and the language, we think of the double empathy thing, and you know, that's wrong, that's not good, you must eat like this, you know. And then I wonder whether, and we know that some autistic people go on to develop mental health issues like anorexia because of the need for control and because of the anxiety. So yeah, you know, so yeah, I think it was quite common for me to kind of find myself in situations with people. I thought, how did that happen? You know, where it was obviously a double empathy thing, where I was knocking up against, you know, a different tribe and we didn't have the understanding that we do now. So yeah, I think that's mainly my own experience of just, you know, realizing more and more that I was a different tribe. Because then when I was identified later on in life, I think I described it at the beginning like a relief. It was like, oh my God, I'm home. It's literally been transformatory. Is that a word? Even though I said at the beginning, I didn't do it to need the support. And what's kind of panned out is I've realized that actually, and I think a lot of autistic people do, they've actually found out that they've coincidentally surrounded themselves by other neurodivergent people from their tribe. Because what happens is as you get older, you know, you kind of lose friends, and you know, and you end up with your tribes. That's where who are on your wavelength. This is what it means. So yeah. You know, I suppose in terms of, you know, difficulties, because I think this is important. So I think it's very, very important to say, although I come across as someone that is, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, high functioning. We don't like these words, you know, language labels, high functioning, articulate, successful. I still really struggle with a lot of things. And sorry, I think that's important because I think what I just said didn't really highlight that enough. So even before coming to talk to you, luckily this morning, I didn't have time to worry. But usually what I would have done is I would have really, because you know, I struggle with perfectionism and wanting to do everything perfectly and in a certain way. I would have wanted to read all my notes, get everything right, and you know, and put a lot of stress on myself, you know. So yeah, so what I'm trying to highlight is, although yes, I on paper look very convincing, I'm probably habituated into masking, and we haven't even touched on masking yet. And I think that's very, very important concept for the medical students to understand. So you know, I'm usually exhausted by the end of the day because my poor little system has to work a million times harder. I think I once heard something, it was Judith Gould, who's a very famous, Dr. Judith Gould, who very prominent figure in the field of girls on the autistic spectrum. And she said it struck her one day, so she's done huge loads of research, and she talked about, she talked loads about girls on the autism spectrum. And she said it really struck her one day when she interviewed a late diagnosed woman who described her day. And she said, you know, this woman had described her day as, you know, just in the first hour of the day, that was like a lifetime, you know, because she had to overthink everything, all the different choices of getting out of bed. Should she put on that sock or that sock? Should she, you know, the multiple things and worries that were going on for that autistic woman. And she said that really explained to her some of the support needs, and she hadn't seen that because the woman had come across as very articulate. And and so masking, I touched on masking. So I think this is important. Again, the doctors might know about it, but this is a very, very common feature of profiles of autistic women. No, it's not like we put our fake masks on like this, but it's, you know, what we know about autistic girls is that, you know, there's this thinking that girls are more socially adapted and more able to put on the mask than maybe males are. And therefore that's why they're not picked up, because they're not the kind of geek trained spotter, you know, stereotype that previously GPs and medical doctors were using their tick box approach looking for. Yeah, so girls can come across as very confident, very outgoing, proficient. I mean, this is what's happened with my daughter, and that's why she wasn't picked up. And it's happened, so she's been picked up and identified. She's then gone to secondary school, and she was identified out of a period of difficulty in school. She was then identified. She's gone to secondary school and she's an ultra masker. And what's happened again, and I'm sharing this example with you, despite having her autistic diagnosis, and because she's masking so well, looking and, you know, smiling and, you know, all the rest of it in the school environment, and then coming home and having extreme overwhelm and meltdowns because she's been triggered, that's caused a lot of issues, because on the surface, you know, there's a thing of she's fine in school, you know, and that can be very confusing to professionals if they're not skilled up working with autistic children or women. And it's the masking effect and the associated Coke bottle effect. And the Coke bottle effect can manifest in extremes, like extreme violence at home, you know, police involvement, or it can manifest in autistic burnout, autistic exhaustion, and it's very debilitating having to put on a mask to behave and perform. And some autistic people they describe it in the metaphor as theatre, the theatre of having to mask the neurotypical people to survive in different environments.
There's some great insights there.
I'm sorry, I'm probably going all over the place.
I'm just so letting you talk.
Yes, hopefully,
because there's so much there.
Hopefully with my age, I'm sorry, because of my ADHD brain, I'm probably going around, all the tabs are open. Hopefully whoever's editing this will be able to put it together.
Yeah, we will.
Yeah.
That's really brilliant. You've covered, you know, loads of stuff there. That's fantastic. So we've talked a bit about, you know, what autism's like for you. We've talked about the sensory processing side of things, talked about masking, talked about your daughter. I wonder if we can perhaps move on to thinking about maybe some specific things that I know you've talked about them, and we can pick them out a little bit from what you've already said, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think doctors and medical students should be thinking about, in particular when it comes to girls and women. So any kind of tips for them as they go out into the world, you know, they're going to be GPs or whatever specialty they're going to go into.
Yeah. Okay, yes. I mean, so I think picking up what I've said before, you know, it's not what you probably think it is. And, you know, I'm really shocked that even some of the, you know, professionals working within the field of autism are still using the medical model. I'm not slating the medical model, because that is the basis on which we now understand autism. But you're not looking for stereotypical repetitive behaviors. You know, you're not looking at your tick box. You need to think creatively. You're looking at the girl that comes into your surgery that maybe has anorexia. You're looking at mum sitting with Johnny, you know, who's at school and getting excluded, and maybe mum's looking very anxious or dad's looking very anxious. You know, you're looking for the wider family nexus. Is that a word? You know, and you might be able to identify people, third party, if you like, coincidentally, because you've got somebody else in front of you. Talk to autistic people. You know, this is really, really important. You know, there's this huge, big, you know, discourse within the autistic community around professionals medicalizing autistic people. Talk, you know, like, you know, people like me who are around or affiliated to the Trust Teaching Hospital, you know, talk to autistic people. Don't talk just to, you know, your professionals. Listen to autistic people, because they're usually experts on themselves. And, you know, I must say I've been very lucky in this particular trust that we're working with fantastic professionals who do use that approach and paradigm. You know, I've worked with, you know, some of the consultants because of my daughter at Seaside View, and it's so refreshing that they're using the approach of no, you don't need to explain, you're the expert on your child, rather than this clip box kind of approach. So yeah, it's breaking down that stereotype of what autism is and looking at it in a different way, and that it can present so differently. You know, within my own group of friends of maybe 5 autistic women, for example, we are all so different. You've got the loud one, the quiet one, the one that doesn't talk, the one that's a nurse, the one that's a, you know, and also it doesn't happen in certain sections of the community. It's across every area of life. I mean, it's not like it's a 21st century thing or a 20th century. It's always been here. It's just a different neurology, you know, like to be, yeah. So, yeah. And yeah, I think that's what I would be saying to doctors, you know, including autistic people and listening to them. And because I
think listening is so important, isn't it? Yeah, that's been a common theme in the conversations I've been having. You know, to listen if someone comes to the GP and says they've got some concerns about themselves, to listen.
Yeah, and also actually something I forgot, I used, you know, the example of anorexia. There's often comorbidity. So, you know, it could be someone that comes in and says, I think I've got ADHD, for example. And it could be the comorbidity being autistic. So, you know, neurodivergence is not usually straightforward. You know, we know that as well. So you could come at it a different route. Or it could be a physical health condition, nothing to do with mental health. We know things like, you know, hypermobility particularly are associated, you know, with autistic. So if I hadn't had a child, and I probably wouldn't have been diagnosed. But what might have happened, what's happening now as I head towards that great menopause I'm heading towards, I'm going in, I've got, you know, because I'm hypermobile, I'm going in saying, oh, my legs are aching and that's aching, you know, you can see I'm hypermobile, yeah? So that I would I've been picked, it's going in different, think outside the box. You know, POTS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. There's lots of things that we know, fibromyalgia. There's a lot of associated physical health conditions that we know are linked to autism as well, and neurodivergence as well. So yeah, I'm not saying, you know, overdiagnose people, but just keep those sort of thoughts just ticking over. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I have a good understanding of autism. I'm doing a master's and I see autistic people everywhere, you know, we're everywhere. And I think, you know, it's an emerging, growing thing, isn't it? It's a growing movement, a whole neurodiversity movement. And, you know, I believe in 50 years, it will, you know, it will be treated as a, maybe a physical health thing. Maybe we'll be the new neurotypicals. We're lucky to be in Brighton, that we're living in a place which accepts diversity. I mean, for my daughter, I'm so pleased. I think I just wanted to share this. She's not having that thing where she thinks she's being given a diagnosis with a disease and like she's been given a bat, the short straw. I'm like, brilliant, we're autistic, fantastic. We can do all these things. And talking like it's a family thing, talking like it's a friendship thing, spinning it like it's a positive, but also not demonizing her when she can't come to sit at the table or she doesn't want her food all mixed up, and just going, okay, you want it differently, that's okay. So again, with doctors being flexible. And also actually thinking about it, what's really made a difference to me going to a GP is, it might be that patient you have that goes in that asks loads of questions all the time. So those are little telltale signs. For example, there's little nuances, maybe who might have anxiety or need more information. Doctors have been patient and given me a little bit of extra time, because as you can hear here, I talk a lot, and sometimes I need to ask the same question quite a few times. And sorry, because you asked about processing earlier on, although, I've always aced it academically. And, I've aced it the first year of my master's. It takes me, I have a visual memory. So oral instructions, forget it. So it takes, my processing time is a lot slower. So, ringing banks, asking for information, it takes me a lot longer so giving patients in the surgery who you have identified as autistic a little bit of extra time, that has really helped as well.
That's brilliant. That's a brilliant tip. Thank you. Gosh, you've shared so much there. I could keep talking all day, actually, but we should probably, think about bringing it to a close. But is there anything else? Is there anything else that's on your mind that you'd like to share with the medical students?
No, I mean, I just, I feel really excited about the project that you're running, because I think this is, where this is, these are, the GPs are gatekeeping. These are the people that might be picking up, autistic people who have not been diagnosed. And so having a different narrative at their fingertips, a different lens, and having the training and being better educated. And I'm not being patronizing, as I was, because I went Rain Man only 2 years ago, and look where I am now. So, I feel really hopeful for change for autistic people, that things are going to be different for them. My daughter's life is going to be very different from mine. And I was jumping around. That's what I meant. She, because of the narrative that I use, the lens that I use, the people that I surround her with, she's going to have a very different life to the life that I had. Looking back, all the things that I had to do, there weren't any adaptations or understanding. Everything was harder for me. She's not going to have that. So equipping GPs and doctors with better knowledge, and getting an identification, it's almost like coming out. So it's the same thing as when someone's been in the closet, for example, sorry to use hackneyed words and stuff, and then to, the relief when one can say, like Philip Schofield, I'm gay, that's a huge relief. And that's how it feels. It's totally transformed my life. It's like the death of one life, and then it's the start of another one. And it's, so getting that from, the medical model and the people up at the trust has really changed my life.
Thank you, Alice. That's fantastic. I'm going to stop recording.
Okay, I hope you've got enough stuff there. Good.